Siamo arrivati in chiusura di questa prima parte del pomeriggio. Tanti spunti, abbiamo avuto tanti spunti da tutti i diversi relatori. È quasi questo viaggio ci ha portato attraverso i nostri contributi a delineare una figura dell'imprenditore che forse è un qualcosa di in più, un qualcosa di diverso rispetto a quello che probabilmente è nell'immaginario collettivo, quindi l'imprenditore è come un professionista che segue dei propri valori, segue dei propri principi, mette nell'azienda qualcosa che è molto di personale, molto personale, molto identitario, che coltiva le relazioni, che coltiva l'intelligenza emotiva, che lavora sulle competenze legate alla parte più umana della professione e che insomma, crea nelle relazioni un valore aggiunto, sia nel momento in cui va a creare una startup, come ci ha giustamente descritto giustamente Marco Dallago nel suo primo intervento, sia dal momento della creazione della startup si parla di team, si parla di persone che lavorano assieme, e ancora di più quando l'impresa sviluppa la sua potenzialità. Anche in quel caso il team, le relazioni, le persone diventano fondamentali. Abbiamo finito, come vi ho detto, la prima parte del pomeriggio. Fra 5 minuti ci sarà spazio per la seconda parte del pomeriggio, quindi lascerò la parola a Carlo Giardinetti. Non so se è già online. No, diciamo che fra 5 minuti. Ah, eccoli Carlo. Ciao Carlo.
Ciao Davide, buon pomeriggio. Sì.
Hai sentito? È stato tanto molto interessante con degli spunti, direi,
senza dubbio,
di valore.
Senza dubbio. Tanti amici, tanti colleghi che mi ha fatto tantissimo piacere riascoltare in un contesto come quello di oggi, di una giornata dedicata all'imprenditoria, e poi anche mi è piaciuto esplorare il significato della parola imprenditore molto più largo che non... io non sono un grandissimo fan dell'idea, ok, startup, scale up, una su 1 milione, questo funnel. In realtà credo che l'imprenditore abbia una missione molto più bella, molto più ampia, di taglie diverse, e oggi con tutti gli ospiti abbiamo ascoltati veramente tutte le sfumature, molto di spiegazioni.
È stato un bel pomeriggio, io adesso ti lascio l'onere della prosecuzione, buon pomeriggio, ciao a tutti. Ciao
Grazie
Carlo.
Davide, ciao.
Ciao.
Allora, proseguiremo in lingua inglese da qui, quindi poi per chi vuole utilizzare la traduzione, la piattaforma di Zoom ci permette, in basso c'è il piccolo mondo che dà l'opportunità di utilizzare la traduzione. Io, per rispetto ai tempi e alle persone che magari vogliono raggiungerci e giustamente sanno che si comincia alle 5, adesso prenderò i prossimi 2 o 3 minuti un po' per cominciare una chiacchierata magari un po' più leggera. In inglese vedo Ellen dall'altra parte del video, e quindi passerò all'inglese e spero, insomma, come ho detto prima, utilizzate pure lo strumento della traduzione se il mio inglese è pessimo. Ellen, I'm going to switch to English now, and like I said, there will be the opportunity for anybody who want to hear the translation in Italian to use the interpretation down. To make sure that we respect timing and perhaps people that are planning to join in 5 p.m. sharp, We have 2 minutes to just make sure we warm up. We enter into the conversation. I see the name in the tag is Pim, whom I know very well, but I see on screen Ellen. And Ellen, maybe you, oh, there's also Pim. Okay. Hi, Pim, great to see you. I can't hear you, Ellen, for some reason. So this is good. We have 1 minute still. We can look at the audio. I still can't hear you, no. So we still have a minute to go. I think, try again. For a second, I could hear the microphone.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
I can. Wonderful.
Okay, well, great that we have that extra minute to check that then.
Absolutely.
So great. So let's just wait a few more seconds before we get going. So we have the nice 5 o'clock start. Maybe people are still grabbing something to drink.
Exactly. A coffee or whatever suits better at this time of the day. Ellen, you guys are connecting from today?
The Netherlands.
Okay, so that's home for you.
Home for us, yeah. So is it okay for me to get going?
I will get us started with a small introduction, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Yes. So it's 5 p.m. I think we can start. Welcome everybody to the second part of the event. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm Carlo Giardinetti. Wear a couple of hats myself in terms of working hats. I work as the Dean of Executive Education at the Franklin University, Switzerland, but I also work as a sustainability lead and leadership senior advisor at Deloitte Consulting. Today, I have the pleasure, really, first of having followed the session until now, and now to facilitate this session where we will talk about corporate rebels. So a small introduction to that. 2 guys that I deeply respect and follow eagerly in their venture, Jost and Pim, 4 years ago. They gave up a promising corporate career and became the corporate rebels. They decided to embrace a mission and purpose to make work more fun. They created a bucket list and they talked and visited over 100 pioneer working places around the world. And what they've learned and what they have been able to share with a growing global community today has been recognized by global media, such as including the New York Times, Forbes, Huffington Post, The Guardian, and the BBC. But also by international awards, such as the Thinkers 50, and by pioneer networks, such as the Lugano Living Lab today, here. So I'm really happy and excited to have Pim and Ellen with us today. I and Pim actually go back, I think, to 2018, and I have since followed eagerly all the progresses, and I've also included some of their work in my Future of Work course at Franklin University, Switzerland, but also in my collaborative leadership, as Pim knows, that I teach at the Harvard University. So I hope many of you will follow the Corporate Rebels cult blog from today. In case you're not doing so yet, I'm sure you will feel intrigued to follow it after this session. Meanwhile, also welcome to Jean Mendes. Hi, Jean. We will connect with you in some time after the presentation by Pim. So Pim, and Ellen, over to you for an exciting presentation, and I will jump in again in around 20 minutes for some Q&A. Meanwhile, I will put my video off so that you get the full stage for you. Okay?
Great. Okay, thank you. Thank you for the very kind introduction, and also a special thanks for us being able to do it in English, because for myself, apart from ciao and gracias, I would say that is my Italian. So I'm happy we can do it in English. So before we get going, a few points to make. If you have any questions, please let us know, because as soon as Pim starts to share his story and questions come in, I'll just stop him on the point to get your questions in. And there's also going to be time for that after Pim's presentation. So before he goes off and shares what he's learned together with Joost over the last 5 years, I'd like to get a bit more of a feeling of the group we have in front of us. So what I'll be doing is I'm going to share a poll with 3 questions and questions you should be able to answer very quickly with a yes or a no to get a feel of what the group is in front of us. So I will launch the poll now. And I'd like to ask you to answer these 3 questions. So first of all, I feel engaged at work, true or false? Secondly, I have access to all company finances. And third, I get to set my own salary. Okay, so the votes are coming in very quickly. Let's see. So I'm happy to say that on feeling engaged at work, we've got a lot of people answering true. Shame to see that some people also have to answer false. So good to see that the first point is an overall majority is true, but after that, it's already getting a bit less. So having access to all company finances, for the most of the people, that is not the case. And I get to set my salary. More people saying false, but actually quite a big group saying true. So it'd be very interesting to hear what your backgrounds are and how it comes you're able to do that. So, okay, great. Thanks for answering this question. And without further ado, I'm going to pass you over to Pim for the next 20 minutes.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here. Good to see these results, actually, because it's quite surprising to me that so many people are engaged at work, and also quite a big group of people, indeed, as Ellen mentioned, have the feeling they can set their own salary. That's going to be interesting. We are going to share in the next 20 minutes a very brief overview of the things that we've seen around the world while visiting all kinds of pioneering organizations. But before we're going to do that, a little bit of background on Corporate Rebels. So for the ones who are not familiar with what we do, a bit of an understanding of why we are actually doing the work that we do. So as Carlo already mentioned, we quit our jobs about 5 years ago. Our corporate jobs in which we were doing the thing that we were trained for, but we didn't really enjoy the work environment. The problem was that there were too many rules, not a lot of freedom. There wasn't any meaning or purpose to what we were doing. And there was the fact that there was always a boss around or a manager around who told you how you should be doing your job. So there wasn't any freedom, any entrepreneurship whatsoever. And for us, this was very frustrating. And after 3 years of working in those corporate environments, we decided to quit. And we set out to solve the problem that we experienced ourselves, but that unfortunately many more people are experiencing at the moment, which is a feeling of not being happy, not being motivated in their work. So the first thing we did was we started to look at the problem in more detail. So we went through lots of studies being done on the topic, research that has been done already for decades on the current state actually of today's workplaces. So let's take a look at how broken today's way of working actually is. First of all, if you look at the levels of engagement in today's organizations, you see that 15% of the world's population is engaged at work. So just 15% of the people feel truly passionate about their work and their work environment. This is, by the way, a big research study done by Gallup, where they ask hundreds of thousands of respondents around the world a couple of simple questions to figure out whether they are engaged, disengaged, or actively disengaged. So if you look at that disengaged group, there's 67% of the people feeling disengaged at work. So they come into the office, they do what they're being told, but they are not truly passionate about the work that they're doing. So that's a shame for those people, but also for the organizations that they're working in. Even worse, 18% of the people are actively disengaged. So they are in the office, or maybe sometimes they are not, because they dislike their work environment to such an extent that they, for example, call in sick while they are not. Or they don't do the work they should be doing and therefore sabotage the work of others in the organization, simply because they don't like their work and their work environment. So it's a painful statistics where you see that more people are actively disengaged and being counterproductive to the organization and their colleagues, and only 15% of the people being engaged at work. Some more stats. So if you look at the symptoms of burnout that people experience in today's workplaces, we see that there's 23% of the people, so of the entire workforce, that always or often experience symptoms of burnout. For example, headache because of too much stress in their work, not being able to work, being at home, not being able to do any of the things they should be doing because they are burned out. There's 44% of the people that sometimes experience those burnout symptoms, and just 1/3 who never experience any of those symptoms. So we're not just disengaging people in the workplace, but we're also literally making people sick. But it gets even worse. If you look at meaning or purpose at work, a lot of people, 40% actually, according to this study, feels that their job makes no useful contribution to society. So they feel that they spend their time either pushing paper around or at least not contributing to something meaningful to society. So to summarize, we have workplaces that disengage people, and we have workplaces that make people sick. And the work that people are doing doesn't feel meaningful to 40% of the people. So in our perspective, the way we work is broken, and we need to do something about it to create organizations where people actually love to be, where they love to contribute, have a lot of autonomy in how they're doing their work, and also feel meaningful when they go back home at the end of the day. And this is very much from a personal perspective. We argue that if you spend 40 hours a week in a job, it should also be a job that you thoroughly enjoy. But if you would look at this from an organizational perspective, and if you care more about the bottom line than about, for example, the happiness of employees, even then it's interesting to focus on creating a workplace where people love to contribute. And it makes a lot of sense, of course. So if you look at some of those statistics, you see that productivity and profit are higher when people are more engaged at work. At the same time, absenteeism, accidents, and defects are lower when people are more engaged at work. So this is pretty common sense. If you like to do something, the outcomes will probably be better too. And there's a strong link, strong correlation between those two elements. So it makes sense from a personal perspective, but also from a business perspective, to create a workplace where people truly love to work. So this was the idea that we built Corporate Rebels around. As I mentioned, we came from different backgrounds. Joost being a nanotechnologist, myself being an industrial engineer. So we had no clue how to make work more fun. But it is the problem that we wanted to solve. So we decided to look for the best organizations, the most advanced pioneers around the world that could teach us something about making work more fun. 5 years ago, we created an overview of all those pioneers, from academics to CEOs to entrepreneurs to internal rebels inside organizations to companies that are doing things differently, that have been able to make their workplace more fun, more engaging, more motivating. And we set out to visit them. Over the past 5 years, we've been all around the world to learn from these pioneers and to share everything we learn through our blog, our book, in sessions like these, to make people aware that work can be quite different than what most people are currently experiencing in the workplace. So what I'd like to do is to go through the main trends that we've seen. So what distinguishes these organizations, these progressive organizations, from the more traditional companies that most of us know? And it's summarized in 8 trends. It's not a fixed model, but it's a source of inspiration to understand what these pioneers are doing differently than the more traditional workplaces. So let's start with the first. On the left-hand side, the top left, you see the focus of more traditional organizations. And on the right-hand side, you see the focus of more progressive organizations. The first one is a move from profit to purpose and values. So in those 100+ organizations that we've been visiting, there's a very strong focus on contributing to something meaningful, having a clear purpose with a clear set of values in place that guide the decision-making in the organization. So people that are working there, customers that are buying their products or services, or suppliers that are supporting these organizations, all focus on creating and achieving and pursuing this purpose of the organization. Of course, making money is vitally important for any organization in order to stay alive, in order to make new investments. But for these companies, that's not the reason they exist. They exist for something more meaningful than just making money for shareholders and for just maximizing the profit every single quarter. Second trend is a move from hierarchical pyramids to a network of teams. And with that, I mean the traditional organizational structure with the CEO on top, then lots of middle management layers in between, and then at the bottom line, the people that are doing most of the operational work. These organizations don't believe that's the best way to organize it. It might have been a good idea 100 years ago when everything was the same every single day. But nowadays, when things change so quickly, when organizations constantly have to adapt to changing customer needs, they feel that a network of team structure is much more applicable to them. Meaning that you have lots of small teams that act as if they are separate businesses that are working together to achieve something they could not achieve alone. So mostly 10 to 15 people together in a team, multidisciplinary teams who are responsible for their own profits, who are responsible for their own investments, their own strategy, their own hiring and firing. So a lot of decision-making power is transferred from the top of an organization to those frontline teams. The third trend is a move from directive leadership to supportive leadership. So from bosses who tell people what to do and how to do their job, that have to make all of the important decisions themselves, towards an environment where you have coaches or coordinators or whatever you would like to call them, people who are supporting their teams as good as they can, not by making decisions for them, but by facilitating whatever is needed for the teams to achieve success. The fourth trend is from plan and predict to experiment and adapt. So moving away from the idea that you can predict what's going to happen in the next year or the next 5 years, and instead focusing on the short term, setting up experiments to test new products, new services, or new ways of working. And then based on what you learn from those experiments, adjust your course. To give you some example, for example, there's a large Swedish bank called Handelsbanken. They employ 14,000 people and they don't have an annual budgeting cycle. They believe that it's not a good idea to waste a lot of time coming up with detailed budgets and detailed plans on what might be happening the year after, to then the next year get stuck in these budgets because there's no freedom anymore to move, for example, money around in the organization. So instead, they have a different process in place that's much more dynamic and allows them to change much quicker than other organizations. And for example, the past year, in times of crises, when things constantly change very quickly, a company like Handelsbanken is much more successful than its traditional counterparts because they are able to change more quickly based on their changing work environment. The fifth trend is from rules and control to freedom and trust. So how can you get rid of all of those rules and policies that dictate how people should be doing their work? So getting rid of fixed travel policies, rules that tell people how they should dress, rules that tell people when they should come to the office and when they can go home. But also more advanced rules that are being let go of, for example, in terms of approvals that are needed in order to make decisions within the organization. So all kinds of things that are being done to give people more freedom, more trust, so they can actually act like responsible adults. So these organizations believe that you don't need rules and control mechanisms in place to make people feel at home, to make people successful. And instead, you should trust them and give them the opportunity to behave like the proper adults that they are. The sixth trend is from centralized authority to distributed authority. So from not just having decision-making in the top of the organization, but instead pushing it down as far to the front line as possible. it is important if you want an organization to change quickly, to listen to its customers very quickly, that you also have decision-making as far to the front line as possible. So the ones that are in contact with customers and suppliers are also the ones that can make decisions quickly. What is needed for that is a lot of transparency. People need to be able to assess all of the information so they can make the best possible decision. So we talk about a trend called radical transparency, where organizations open up their company financials, the performance of teams, individuals, and the entire organization. But also, for example, opening up salary levels, so everyone can see who earns what, in order to create as much transparency and create more trust through this transparency than in organizations where they prefer this more secret approach, where only information is available in certain parts of the organization. The eighth one is a move from job descriptions to talents and mastery, where you get away from the idea that you have a fixed job description that neatly states a person's day-to-day activities. And instead, these organizations believe that you have to give people the opportunity to find their main talents and to craft a job or to build a job around those main talents. That's vitally important if you want to engage and motivate people, but it's also important if you want to leverage all of the talents in your organization. And then giving people the opportunity to constantly develop those. So let me quickly give an example of an organization that is quite strong on these 8 trends that will help you to make these trends come to life. So if you look at a very purpose-driven organization that has a network of team structure with not a lot of middle management in place, in fact, no middle management whatsoever. If you look at supportive leadership, freedom and trust, one of the prime examples is an organization called Buurtzorg. It's a Dutch healthcare organization employing 15,000 people. And among those 15,000 people, there's not a single manager in the entire organization. So you have 2 directors at the top of the organization. They're not the ones making decisions for those other 15,000, but they facilitate a work environment where those teams, where those individuals can do their work in the best possible way. So it's a fully self-managing organization, more than 1,000 teams of 10 to 12 people who take care within their own neighborhoods of the hiring, firing, onboarding, recruitment, planning, execution of their work. So within this healthcare organization, you see a lot of these trends very clearly. The beauty of it is that their costs are 2/3 lower than the traditional healthcare organizations in the Netherlands. So their overhead costs are 67% lower. Employee engagement is way higher at this organization. Client satisfaction is a lot higher in this organization. Productivity in this organization is a lot higher. So you see that it's not just beneficial in terms of engagement, but also in terms of business outcomes and doing the work more successfully. So that's just one example of an organization doing that. On our blog, you can find many, many more of these pioneering organizations that are redefining what work looks like. And I think it's interesting to mention that a lot of these companies are not the usual suspects. It's not the companies from Silicon Valley that we all love to look up to. But these organizations that you've probably never heard of, that have been able to organize their work in radically different ways. And we believe their stories need to get out there so more people can see that work doesn't have to be this frustrating, terrible experience that many people, unfortunately, today experience. So that was an introduction into our main trends, the things that we've learned over the past couple of years. Now let's go over to some of the questions that you have on the topics that I've just talked about. So back over to you, Carlo.
Tim, how refreshing and how interesting. I completely agree with you that a lot of those stories are a little bit hidden around the world, and the job that you have done with the corporate rebels are going out and surface those stories and make them available for the global communities is really precious. And what I can confirm as well is that actually there's a lot of large and, let's say, better known companies that They might certainly not be able to tick all the boxes, but they are indeed trying in one way or another, because they either have corporate rebels inside, planted as a Troy horses. We could use also that metaphor, and that they're trying to move some levers, and of course sometimes it's not so simple. But today we also have an audience of entrepreneurs, and which might explain the level of engagement with the poll, with the initial poll, because as entrepreneurs and future entrepreneurs, they feel perhaps more engaged. And my question would be, there is this idea that at the startup level, at the beginning, there's a lot of fun, that you can work 20 hours and not feeling it, because all the power and the energy is there. However, in the next phase, when it goes to scale up and growth, the fun seems to be going away, almost as a natural evolution. What's your experience with that, and any advice that you could share?
Yeah, interesting question. There's this phenomenon that is often being talked about in this field, and it's kind of called the startup, scale up, fuck up, where you organize yourself in a very successful way at the beginning. As you mentioned, there's a lot of passion, a lot of motivation to get things started and get things up and running and make their impact on the world. Then during the scale up phase, it's maybe still a little bit there, but you can already feel some of the more traditional processes coming into place. You maybe have venture capitalists that are joining the organization, or other investors joining the organizations that might have a very clear view on how they would like to organize the company. So the problem, I think, is in this phase, that in the scale-up phase, is that you lose a lot of those initial ways of working. You lose a lot of that excitement as the company grows, as the company needs to become more so-called professional. And we tend to come up with a lot of more corporate, more traditional practices, because many people think that's the only way to organize work on a large scale. And then if they come after this scale up phase, they enter the fuck up phase, where they kind of lose everything that they had. They become just any other organization where there's not this passion, where there's not this freedom, etc., to focus on all of these things. So I think what is vitally important is to rethink the way you would like to work already in a very early stage of an organization. When you're still small, it's way easier to change things. And I think it's also vitally important, if you want to continue the success of an organization for a very long period of time, not just financial success, but also success in terms of motivation and engagement. You need to make very deliberate design decisions at the very beginning. For example, like the company I just mentioned, Buurtzorg, they, in the beginning, already decided that they didn't want to scale the organization with a traditional hierarchy. First of all, it would be way too slow. Secondly, then if they would have so much bureaucracy, they wouldn't be efficient and successful anymore in delivering good work. So they said already in the beginning, we are going to organize with self-managing teams of 10 to 12 people who will be running their team as if it's a separate business, and they're fully responsible for it. So if they're successful, they are the ones that also feel this success. If they are unsuccessful, they are actually the ones that also have to suffer the consequences. And they might actually lose their job if they're unsuccessful for a long period of time. So they already have the ownership as part of their design in the organization. And they've been able to grow within 6-7 years from just 4 people to 15,000 people. So you see that it's possible to scale very rapidly and to still keep that fun, that engagement, that motivation in the organization, even if you scale the organization to such an extent. But it's about making those deliberate design decisions at the very start, because if you want to make them, if you have 250 or maybe 1,000 employees, it's going to be way harder to change the organization than when you design it already up front from the beginning.
And that would become also, in many ways, a different pitch that startups need to learn to present to their investors, because very often the investors are then looking at the next phase on, how are you going to organize, how are you going to structure, how are you going to control your growth. And I think there is a need for developing new type of pitches for investor that says, I'm going to scale up while I keep the fun and the good that I have today. And maybe that's an area where in the future you can help as well in all the different entrepreneurs.
Yeah, and there are some investment companies that are already popping up that are doing things differently and that focus also not just on the product and the service, but also much more on the way of working. And they believe that if you remain a purpose-driven organization, if you don't lose that, if you organize in less hierarchical ways, that the organizations that they invest in will also in the end be more successful. So I think there's a strong incentive also for people, for investors to do things differently. But I think we have to increase awareness first before more people actually start working like this.
That's great. And I'm conscious of time, but I want to try a brief 30 seconds from you. Characteristics of the Ticino, this region, and also the north of Italy, is that we have a lot of family businesses. So entrepreneurs that are not necessarily going through the what we just call now the startup and scale up, but became entrepreneurs. And family business are very well known for being able to care of their people very well, because they have a different attitude in that sense. I'm not so sure though about the fun part in family business. Sometimes it is there, sometimes I don't know many stories. Have you come across of family businesses, anything that you can share in that space?
Yeah, so we have seen quite a lot of family businesses also being organized progressively. The good thing about family businesses is they have complete control over their organization, that they can actually, if they make a decision to organize more progressively, they can actually make the organization do it. And with, for example, corporates, it's harder because there's a lot of shareholders that want to have a decision-making power in this as well. So for family businesses, there's an opportunity to do this. And I agree with you that they tend to take care of people better, at least, than corporate organizations. But I think also in terms of how they're structuring their work, there's still a lot to be improved. Where also in traditional, or also in family businesses, there's quite a traditional approach to work often, where sometimes it's even going in the direction where the leaders of an organization feel as if they are the kind of parents of the people in the organization. And instead of giving them the freedom and trust to make their own decisions, they kind of start acting in a more parental way, which I think in the end is not that good. If you really want to create an environment built around the autonomy of people. So I think there's different things, different aspects into play that come into play. And I think there's an opportunity to do things very differently in these family businesses. And I think more organizations should be grasping those opportunities, not just to be better than their competitors, but also to engage their people and make their work more fun.
Excellent. And it makes a lot of sense to me, especially since the new generation of family business. Now, family business are handed over from generation to generation. Sometimes in that passage, in that transition, there is an opportunity also to maybe redesign some of the elements. So I would like now to invite Professor Jean Mendes to come on stage and with the video. Professor Jean Mendes is Professor of Organizational Communication at USI. And thanks for joining in for some further reflections. And I know you have also questions that you bring from your master students. So over to you, Jean.
Thank you very much, Carlo, and warm welcome to everyone also from my side. It's a great pleasure to be here. And also thanks to Pim for the very inspiring talk. When the Living Lab came to me and said, you know, if I wanted to do this, and I heard that you're going to be the keynote tonight, I was really excited, and I thought it would be a great opportunity not just to come by myself, but also bring along my students, who unfortunately you cannot see at the moment. But in the spirit of participation and flat hierarchies, I thought I'm not going to just do my panel by myself, but they prepare some questions for you as well. So For technological reasons, I was told they cannot ask the questions themselves, but I will be their spokesperson. I hope you don't mind me doing that. So I was really, inspired by this courage that you had of leaving your professional jobs and going on to look for inspirational leaders and, about your project in general. So congratulations to that. And I guess my role today is also to be a little bit of a challenger and, maybe create some debates and maybe question some ideas that you have in a spirit of an exchange of ideas. So the first thing that struck me is, on the one side, you're saying that your 8 kind of trends that you just presented to us are not a fixed model, and they're not some silver bullet line that we should follow one by one, and you also show quite nicely how they work in very different contexts. But the question that kind of came to my mind was, are there situations when, freedom is problematic? Or are there situations when supportive leadership is problematic? Or are there situations when we want to have clear rules rather than just being driven by purpose and values? So my first question to you would be, where would you set the boundaries of your points, or of your principles? And maybe reflect a little bit on, can there also be negative repercussions of these approach that you're suggesting? The context of this is a little bit, many of the things that I've seen on your list was, as you also mentioned, is what we're knowing from Silicon Valley. And in recent years, there has also been quite a critical debate on, how Silicon Valley actually, I was thinking, for example, I remember the first time I went to the Googleplex in California, I was struck that no one actually used, for example, their swimming pools and all their kind of fun activities, but people were busy working. So in many ways, how much is this also a rhetoric that is inducive to certain notions of productivity without you knowing? And so shall we just take over these new ways of working as the new standard, or how critical should we be relative to this? So what are the boundaries of these principles?
Well, I think what is important to understand is that why we say it's that every organization should find their own way. I think what is important to understand is that there is not a single solution that works in every sector, every culture, every specific organization, and also not, and I think this is more important, not every of these 8 trends works perfectly well for every single individual. And there might be some people that prefer to have an environment where they're being told what to do and where they have less freedom. What we've seen in our research is that about 15 to 20% of the people leave an organization in a transformation like this. And the reasons they leave is because they say, we don't want to work in a liberated environment. We want to keep, for example, our position in the hierarchy with our decision-making power, or we just want to be told what to do. And it's 15 to 20% of the people. Unfortunately, the way we organize work is traditional in about 95 or even more % of the cases. So I think there's a disbalance between those people that want a traditional work environment, or at least that say they want a traditional work environment, and the amount of traditional work environments around. I think the balance is completely wrong. If we would have 80 to 85% of the companies organized very progressively, and just 15 to 20% of them traditionally, I think that would make much more sense. Then people can more easily decide where they would like to work and what kind of environment they'd like to work. And I think that it is important for any organization to keep in mind the perspective of their people. And if they work in the financial sector or in healthcare or in government or in an IT company, they might have different challenges that they have to face than people working in a different organization. And I think it all starts with having a conversation. What is it that frustrates you in your current work and in your current organization? And how can you get rid of that frustration? What are ways of working that we can maybe learn from other pioneers to adopt in our own organization to see if we can change and make work better for the people working in our organization? And it's about listening to employees, setting up experiments to change, and then finding your way towards your own ideal way of working. And for us as a company, that might be very different than when you would look at a, for example, healthcare organization or a government organization. I think it's important to share that. I think it's important for people to understand it's about having that conversation with employees to understand how to make work better. And then look at these 8 trends as a source of inspiration to see how you can actually make a change and what you can learn from others that have already gone before you.
So for example, one of my students was asking, there are people who just want to do their tasks and be told what to do. So that you would say that is a small percentage of your organization. And for them, maybe it would be right to have a certain set of rules without taking over responsibilities, without having a pressure to be innovators and entrepreneurs, but to be able to do a more kind of 9-to-5 job if they wish to do that.
Yeah, well, it depends. I think also organizations could argue for the fact that they don't want to be a workplace like that they want to be progressive, have an environment where people have autonomy, are trusted, and can make decisions themselves. And that if people don't want to be part of that kind of new type of environment, that they are advised to leave the organization. Or you could have a differentiation within an organization, but I don't think that will hold on for lots of years. I think you will get some frustration in the organization by doing that. And I think this is also where it's important to underline the one trend that I talked about is the trend on a network of team structure, where you split up a bigger organization into smaller entities. And within those entities, there might be differences in culture, where you have one that might be a bit more traditional than another. And people can more easily move between these different teams or entities, depending on what their preferences are for a work environment. And I think this is also important. We should also have a diversity in this and not force everybody to work exactly according to these 8 trends, simply because we say so. I think it's much more important to give people the opportunity to find their own ideal situation, ideal working situation.
So thank you. Another kind of question I have was, you went to all these pioneers, you went to people that you had in your bucket list as inspiring leaders, but now you're working as a consultant, I imagine, also in organizations which are less progressive or which are on the ways there. So the question is around how you make change happen. How do you go from, let's say, we are all socialized in this traditional ways of doing work, either in our current organization or in previous work experience, and we have to get into the habit of kind of doing things differently. But we also know we routines have their importance. We have we talk about organizational inertia. We have organizational cultures which ground organization in certain ways of doing, which might not always be ideal. So how do you go about transforming an organization, let's say a more traditional organization, in a more progressive organization, which might be a little different than starting off as pioneers and having this kind of entrepreneurial drive from the start?
Yeah, I think what is important, like you see, there's a number of different approaches. Some are more top-down, others are more bottom-up. And we always differentiate between kind of 3 different ways of doing that. So you have the bottom-up approach, where one team or maybe one department in the organization decides to start doing things differently. And they can make a change, but they cannot make a radical change, as in they can't change the entire organizational structure of that company because they simply don't have the power to do so. So they start making changes in their own part of the organization, changing the things they can influence. And then if they are successful, many others in the organization will jump on board, and you kind of create a more social movement within the organization.
Like an attractor.
Yeah, yeah. And that works in some organizations, that works really well, especially if you don't have a mandate from the top. But if you have a traditional organization where somebody at the top of the organization wants to create change, then there's also an opportunity to do that. Some organizations decide to do it with maybe 1 or 2 years preparation, and then bringing the organization into this new state almost overnight. So it's very risky. Mostly you see performance drop for a while and only then go back up. A more or less risky, more safe approach would be to, even if you have mandate at the top, start in one specific part of the organization. Give them the freedom to experiment with new ways of working, maybe change the structure, get rid of the bureaucracy in that part of the organization, and give them the freedom to do things in a new way. And if you figure out what works, then translate it to other departments in the organization and bring them along on that change. So it always focuses quite a lot on finding the pioneers in an organization, setting up experiments, because beforehand nobody knows what's going to work. So you better test and try and learn. And then bring more people into that new way of working as you see what is successful in your specific work environment.
Did you face kind of resistances, rebels against rebels?
Yeah, all the time. So to clarify, we're not really consultants. So what we do is we learn from all of these organizations and share it, and not really kind of go through that whole transformation process ourselves. We believe organizations are much more successful when they do it themselves. So without that external support, they just need the ideas to get started. So, but there's always, in all of these transformations that we're researching, that we're following, you see always also a counter movement, as I think in any change among people, that you have maybe a couple of people that are super excited and that others might not want to jump on board, or maybe even sabotage or work against what those pioneers are doing. And I think that's really where the rebellious spirit comes into play, where you need to keep pushing, keep challenging, and keep trying new things to make sure that you still get where you want to be, and measure the things that you're doing and if they are successful or not, because that helps you a lot in convincing other people to jump on board.
I think one of the very interesting things what you're saying is about this kind of experimentation, but also is about making an experience firsthand, that you can try stuff out and feel how it acts and how it feels like and stuff like that. Can you provide maybe an example of how this? For that, you also have to create some sort of a safe haven, where this experimentation is possible, where you're not punished against, or if you're making mistakes and stuff like that. Can you provide an example of what are the conditions that you can do this experimentation and experiences firsthand? What is necessary for in order to be able to do that?
I think it's important to start small in any way. So even if you're just working in a team, in an organization that doesn't have a lot of decision-making power to change these things, I think it's about opening up the conversation within that team of things you would like to do different, things that you are currently frustrated by, that you would love to change. And then together with, or in that discussion around that frustration, start thinking about ideas or things you've seen in other places or heard in other places that might be able to solve that specific problem, that frustration that you have. It could be a very specific thing, like for example, the meeting structures, or the way you give feedback to one another, or the way you make decisions in an organization. Get the conversation going around where the frustration is, and think about and learn from pioneers on how you can actually do those things differently. So even on these super practical levels, for example, changing the way meetings are run, or the way decisions are being made within a small team, can boost the engagement of people and the motivation of people to a very high extent. In many cases, more than the big changes in organizational structure that will follow later on. So even these small changes can be very powerful. So I think it's important to start there, to think of even these small things that could change, that could help a team be more engaged at work. And once you have success in those early changes, then it's about trying to make those bigger changes and bringing in more people. And I think that's an important thing to do, because if you start small, you can learn how to experiment. And of course, one of the requisites of that is that you have a bit of freedom to experiment. So you need to have, for example, a team leader who's also into this. If there's a person that's constantly pushing back on all of the initiatives that you take, then if you keep trying that and if you still don't get anywhere, then I suggest you leave and find another team in the organization, or maybe even a different organization to work for. Because I think it's also important to understand that if you can't change it, if you can't not change it, and if you continuously try to, but you get too much pushback from the organization, you might actually be a better fit in another organization where you have a bit more freedom to experiment with that new ways of working.
I see Carlo. Carlo, do you want to intervene? Or
Jean, yeah, I'm looking at time, and one of my roles is trying to get us and keep us within the timing. But we have our last 10 minutes, so my suggestion would be to stay together in these last 10 minutes. And there's two topics that I want to pick up out of what you have introduced in this very interesting Q&A. One is really the last one on the failures, mistakes, and making space for that. One thing that I have found extremely useful is was introduced by Amy Edmondson, a Harvard Business School professor, where she says it's very important to introduce a new language for failures and mistakes inside organizations. So we need to be able to distinguish mistakes and failures. That's not all one bucket, right? There are mistakes. If we know the process, we've done it, we have the skills, we've been trained, I think we have to understand that those kind of mistakes are not welcome by nobody. That would be silly, right? It's the mistakes that should be prevented. The good news is those mistakes are easy to fix because we know already the solution to them is just something that should have not happened. Then there are other mistakes in complex situations. While we understand that the complexity of today's business is different, we're applying solutions that we know don't always work. There is where I find it very interesting. In organizations that are able to bring those mistakes to the surface as fast as possible, they are able to talk about them and fix them. They have a competitive advantage compared to those organizations that have a culture of silence because they are scared to be punished if they bring a mistake to the table. And that is certainly something that can be avoided. And we know that this concept of psychological safety, which is very important in those organizations. And finally, there are the type of mistakes that are more, the desirable one, the one that we really want to do as fast as possible because we are in an innovative process. So we want to learn fast from what doesn't work to build what works. And I wonder, have you found, Pim, in your, exploring different companies, that there is a maturity in handling mistakes differently in this type of more progressive organization? That is just not every mistake is free. It's just that they learn to talk about mistakes differently.
Yeah, very clearly we see that in these organizations. So they want to create, as you mentioned, this psychologically safe work environment where people dare to try new things, because you can invite people to experiment, but if you punish them when things will go wrong, nobody in the entire organization will actually start experimenting. So these organizations take very practical steps sometimes to create more of this psychological safety. For example, by opening up the conversation around mistakes, where you have maybe every 2 or 3 weeks a session in which you only discuss the mistakes that were being made, where people admit their mistakes, which at first is already a painful thing to do. But if you get used to it, it feels much more comfortable and people actually start listening to each other so they can learn from each other's mistakes and they won't have to make the mistake twice. So, for example, a company that's very strong on this is Spotify. When we visited them in their Stockholm headquarters, we learned about some of the things they do. So they have these every 3 weeks, they have these so-called fail sessions where they discuss the biggest failures they've made. They run a blog series on their intranet sharing, of people sharing the biggest mistakes that they've made. Once again, to create an environment where it's okay to admit your mistakes and to all make sure that you learn from it. Another one is what they do is that the CEO, Daniel Ek, gets on stage during town halls every 3 weeks and also talks openly about the mistakes that he made. Once again, to create a very safe work environment. Other companies organize fuck-up nights or similar things to constantly have a conversation around the things that are going well and also the things that are not going well. To celebrate it, to say, okay, we learned from this mistake, let's now continue not making the same mistake twice. And giving people the opportunity to be very open about it. And if I compare that to my corporate experience, that was the exact opposite. So if you made a mistake, your only goal was to make sure that nobody else figured out. And the problem was that nobody else learned from the mistake. And another problem was that the failure or the mistake that was being made could never be corrected because nobody knew about it. So we constantly had this mistake that was continuing through the organization and nothing was actually changing because people were scared to be open about it.
And you mentioned the fuck up night. I want to make sure that we remind to all the participants here and the one that are following that tonight there is this marathon today continues, and tonight at 8 p.m. there will be also the fuck up night with great guests that are sharing their fuck up accidents or lucky events, I would say. So I think we will post a link into the chat soon for those who want to sign up for the fuck up night. And then we still have a few minutes. The second point that you have introduced, Jean, was about the structure versus the freedom. And so who want more of what? And when I met with Pim the first time, I was working in a university where we decided for our department to use a system called holacracy, which is a system of radical empowerment. And I remember I never worked in a more structured organization than holacracy. So yes, there were no manager, but in the absence of manager, what happens is that you build common rules. Then that structure could take the form of different ways. For holacracy, there was a constitution. But a lot of organizations, there is a myth that must be somehow reviewed, that if you don't have a hierarchy, you don't have structure or you don't have rules. Actually, most organizations that do use self-management, they experience an intensity of structure to support the work. It's just a very different type of structure, right?
Yeah, I fully agree with you. And there are a couple of those ideas about progressive organizations that I think are false. So for example, you say that the one that you mentioned, like in these maybe flat or self-managing organizations, there's no structure. That's, as you mentioned, wrong. There's a lot of structure, but in a different way. And it helps people to be more free within that kind of, those kind of boundaries. At the same time, in these organizations where there's no managers, people assume that there's also no leadership or there are no leaders. I think that's wrong too. Like in these self-managing organizations, you don't have people who are appointed to be a leader and promoted into leadership positions, but they have the opportunity to step up as leaders. And if they can make people follow them, then they will become a natural leader in the organization. So I would argue there's actually more leadership and more leaders in these progressive organizations than there are in traditional organizations where people might have manager title, but not really being a true leader in the sense of being able to create a following and to get people to where they want to go. So I think there's a couple of those important misassumptions or misunderstandings about these ways of working. And I think you mentioned a very good one, also the one on structure. So it's about looking beyond the buzzwords and the hypes and really looking at what are making these organizations different in terms of structures, in terms of leadership, etc., than those more traditional ones.
Can I ask a follow-up question, Carlo, if we have still time? one of the things that my students wondered about, and which I think could be, you were saying before, we have to start small, we have to start locally, and we have to be attentive to the small things. For example, how we structure a meeting, how we set up a certain atmosphere, how we make sure that we have the psychological safety where you can feel that you can expose your vulnerabilities and so on. One of the things that, I got some questions was around these changes that we witnessed this last year with the COVID-19 on a meeting, for example, much more virtually, where, for example, the spatial arrangement has changed a lot, and the boundaries between private and corporate has changed a lot. So a lot of these attentions to the small have changed quite a lot, and many of those are probably also here to stay. We are probably not having the same arrangement of meetings as we had before. We're certainly going back in some ways, but not all together. So I was wondering, how do you see how this kind of cultural changes? Because a lot of the things that we're doing now with this screen meetings is that it's very functional, right? We meet because you have this talk and I ask my questions, and then a second later I'm gone and you're going home and whatever. So all this, the serendipity, the kind of more relational quality, you talked about experiences, and experiences is embodied, is actually going there. I very much appreciate it in your book that you describe how these people dressed, and how these people, how places felt like, and talking about surfing and everything. So I was just wondering, how would you assess this virtualization of work in relation to your principles?
I think a couple of interesting things happened over the past 12 months. So first of all, before 2020, a lot of companies said we can never work remote. We can never allow our people to work from home because they will not work. They will focus their time on doing other things. We will go bankrupt if we give people the opportunity. It will be complete chaos. Well, interestingly, we learned kind of the exact opposite of that. So people are more productive. Some are actually more engaged. So if they don't have the problems at home or have to take care, for example, of their kids while they can't go to school, people who don't have that actually have higher engagement as well now working from home. So I think that's interesting in itself already. We've proven, or the pandemic has proven, that it can actually work for many organizations. What I think is important is to not just simply copy paste the way of working of the office and bringing it into a virtual environment. So what we've seen over the past year is that many people who had a lot of meetings at the office now still have a lot of meetings, they just do them at home. And they don't really rethink their way of working. So they just take their physical environment to an online environment and not rethink their processes, their structures, the way they run meetings. So for example, a lot of the companies that have already for decades worked remotely, or for years worked remotely, they've created a whole new way of communicating, for example, with each other. And they don't constantly have meetings behind their laptops, but they communicate in other ways, in a more asynchronous way, where people do the work in their own ideal time and not when everybody has to come together during a meeting. So I think that's important to understand, that we shouldn't just take the physical environment and put it online, but also focus on creating new ways of working around this that better fit the environment, the new type of environment, and also that better fit what people should be doing in their work, and giving people more autonomy by giving them the opportunity to do the work, for example, according to their own ideal time. So I think that's important to understand, that we shouldn't just bring the physical office to an online environment, but that we should also rethink other aspects of our way of working.
I would like to thank you, Pim, very, very much. We reached our time limit. We actually went over for a couple of minutes, but it's been extremely interesting. And I would like to thank you, Professor Jen, for your questions and reflections. What a wonderful day so far. Again, it's not over. Everybody is welcome to sign up for the Fuck Up Night tonight. And once again, thank you very, very much. And thank you for all who have followed us for the whole day and for this last session. Have a wonderful evening. and we will close it here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.